The Joe Rogan Experience.
Now, when you work as a coach for George, you weren't just working as a jiu-jitsu coach. You were working in almost like a mastermind sort of a position. I saw some conversations that you had with him where you discussed various things. And in fact, one of the things you came to me about was you asked me if I knew anyone who was proficient at the spinning back kick. And that's how I got to working with George. Your coaching with him was not just simply like these are the principles of jiu-jitsu, this is what I want you to work on when the fight goes to the ground. You were working on a lot of different aspects.
Yes.
Like you were a guy that sort of put it together. Now, when you don't have a background in striking and you're looking at all of these various disciplines and trying to formulate a strategy for a guy who's just such a supreme athlete like George, how did you formulate that? Did you do it based on the individual, based on their physical strengths and limitations, and sort of formulate what you think would be the best approach? Did you work it out with him in conjunction?
When George comes to train with me, there's a bunch of considerations. First of all, George lives in Montreal. I live in New York, so time is always an issue.
Well, he does go down there.
He goes down there quite often, but it's not like a squad. The squad's there like 7 days a week, 3 times a day. George was never like that. So in the time available, we'll work on what we can. So everything's always done with George. Okay, how much time is available, and what is the scenario that's coming up? For George, almost always it was an upcoming mixed martial arts fight. Okay, so a lot of people often ask me, say, how come you didn't teach Georges St-Pierre leg locks? Why wasn't he leg locking everyone in MMA? Well, that's a good question. First off, leg locking, as you saw from the Gordon Ryan clip, requires, if it's not done well, leg locking is one of those things where if it's done well, it's amazing, but if it's done badly, it's the worst looking thing in the world. It's a disaster. Secondly, George's game, because his takedowns are so strong, is almost always done from top position on the ground. It's rare for George to be in bottom position on the ground. And in a fight situation, if you're already on top of someone and you've got the striking prowess of Georges St-Pierre, I was happy to coach him more in what we call grapple boxing, the skill of grappling to punching on the ground. It just made more sense for him. He's competent in leg locking, but he's not like Gary Tonin, Eddie Cummings, or Gordon Ryan. Could he finish most black belts? Yeah, absolutely. But why would you stake a fight where literally millions of dollars are being fought? There's a legacy on the line. Why would you take that risk when you could just stay on time and just punch him out like he did with, say, John Fitch, for example?
Right.
So it didn't really make sense to push that hard on George. Your question, though, was, okay, well, what about these other skills? What about standing position? Well, I'm fascinated not just by jiu-jitsu, but by martial arts in general. Mm-hmm. And I've always believed all the various sport martial arts in the world have areas where they are particularly strong. For example, people make fun of Taekwondo. No one does Taekwondo on MMA. You'll back me up on this, Joe. There are some Taekwondo players out there at Olympic level who can kick with a skill level that most people can't even imagine. I've seen people like Herb Perez do kicking demonstrations where you're looking at, this is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen in my life. And this is a guy who, if he hits you, he's going to take your head off. It's impressive to behold.
I was there when Herb Perez was in his prime. Yeah. I watched him KO quite a few people. I watched him KO one of the U.S. national champions with an axe kick.
Some of the worst KOs I've ever seen in my life came from Taekwondo. Like, they tend to involve like jump spinning kicks where there's just huge amounts of kinetic energy being developed. You see the same thing in point fighting karate. You see some terrible knockouts in point fighting karate.
Sure.
People make fun of these sports like
well, on their own is the issue.
That's the issue. The issue. On their own, they got problems. But if you can integrate that into a well-developed, complete skill set, they could be incredibly effective. And I always saw tremendous potential for Taekwondo's jump spinning back kick. No one does spinning back kicks better than Taekwondo. That's one of their main things, and they do it incredibly well. The setups are fantastic. The application, the mechanics, everything's super impressive. So I always thought that would be George had a good spinning back kick, but I thought that would be a nice addition. You always want to be building new skills into a opponent. You don't want to be that predictable guy where everyone knows what you're doing, and I know you came from Taekwondo background, and so I thought that would be an interesting thing for you to work on with him.
Well, it was a funny conversation because that was my specialty.
Yes.
And so when you brought in, I always wanted to talk to you. I always found you a fascinating guy. So when you came up to me and you said, "Do you know anyone?" It's almost like a trick question.
It was a trick question.
And I was saying, and when
do you know anyone besides Joe?
And what I said, I was hesitant. I was like, okay, you're not going to believe this, but
the truth is, I knew you had a good jump spinning back kick. I was trying to subtly.
Did you know?
Yeah.
How did you know?
Word gets around, tough guy.
Okay. I thought you were just fucking with me. But I felt like when I was telling you, I was like, man, I don't even want to. I wish I knew someone who did it as well as me.
You should have just been like, yeah, I've got the best jump spinning back kick in the fucking world.
Not really. I did jump spinning back kick quite a bit, but I prefer a regular spinning back kick.
Yeah.
I want my foot on the ground because I push off that
Yeah.
foot.
Yeah.
There's a significant amount of force in that left leg pushing off that back.
Interestingly, you're seeing some guys out there now having good success in MMA with spinning back kicks. I remember seeing Michael Page hit a beautiful one.
He's got everything. That guy can do everything. Very impressive. He's another guy who came from that point fighting background. Which, you see Raymond Daniels and him and a lot of these guys from that background that are developing.
Raymond Daniels worked with George for his last 2 fights. Very, very impressive guy.
Phenomenal. Yeah, and again, he had just the point fighting skills, and now he's developing real boxing skills, and he's, you've seen him in Bellator kickboxing.
Yeah, you see the integration of the two. It's incredible.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mean, he could just do things physically that most kickboxers just really don't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
He'll jump up and do what's called like a touch spinning back kick. Like he'll jump up and touch you with the front leg. And
I saw that. He hit it in a glory fight, I believe.
Yes.
And beautiful.
Yeah,
technique.
he's phenomenal. He's phenomenal. But again, when you see that, it's like those things by themselves, you're just going to get taken to the ground and smashed. And most people, unless you land one of those catastrophic spinning back kicks right away, the odds are you need all those other things as well, of course, in order to be particularly effective. Which is why George was such a unique
George can
case.
get away with that kind of thing. Yeah.
But that was a fun moment. It was interesting because I've always wanted to show somebody this. It's because it's a weird little thing that I know how to do.
Going back to your original question, the idea of George and shoot box, you'll see that George's entire methodology in the standing position is built around the concept of a dilemma. The dilemma is always between his jab and his takedown. People always talk about proactive and reactive takedowns. Okay, this guy's a reactive this guy's a proactive takedown guy. The thing about George is he would use his jab proactively, but he would use his takedowns reactively. Now that's interesting because George would literally provoke people.
You're saying
into
this.
The takedown.
I just want to point this out. Past tense. You're saying this like you know something I don't know.
No.
Because George just won the middleweight title, relinquished the title, and then the great speculation is, will George fight again?
Yeah, the truth is that no one knows because it comes down to medical problems. George has he's got a problem in his stomach. And
it's like colitis, is that what it is?
Yeah. And
what is that exactly?
It's I'm not going to claim to be a medical expert, but it's one of the most frustrating things that George has had to deal with where there are certain parts of the human body that are just out of your control, and the stomach is one of them. Just things happening in your stomach, you can't control it. Things like stress seem to make it worse. The truth is that no one really knows at this point. So wherever there's doubt, my instinct is to think, well, do you really want to come back, George? You've done all this. And
what a great way to cap off a career, too.
It was amazing. It was impressive.
And I got to tell you, when he came back, this is what was really interesting about that fight. George had said, I'm better. I'm a better martial artist than I was before. And he looked better.
Yeah.
He definitely looked like he was a little out of competition. Like there was moments.
After 4 years, he should.
Yeah,
you know?
should.
How many fighters do you know came back after a 4-year layoff?
Very few. But skill-wise, he looked phenomenal. I mean, his striking looked incredibly smooth. And I think you could see it in Bisping's face, like pretty early on.
Yeah.
Like this is not a rusty Georges St-Pierre. This is not a small welterweight who's, making his way into middleweight. He looked huge. He looked phenomenal. His technique, the way he was landing leg kicks and his sharp jab, and then ultimately that left hand that he used to stun Bisping and get him on the ground. I mean, he looked sensational.
Yes. You were there the night George went into his first retirement, and you'll recall the whole retirement thing was kind of, the speech was vague, it wasn't clear, it was confusing, and because in truth he didn't know if he wanted to retire. The whole thing was actually contrived in the octagon, right there in front of you. It would have been a hard fight. The training camp hadn't been the best camp. The fight for Hendricks was, George was unclear if he wanted to fight at all. There's all kinds of controversies involved in the fight, and then when the fight was over, it was a very close fight, and he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. There was a language miscommunication, and ultimately he essentially walked away from the game. And he walked away for 4 years. That's a long time to be out of a sport that's as young as MMA, which is evolving all the time. Every year the sport changes, and the belts tend to change hands very, very quickly. So when George started talking to me about the idea of, okay, I want to come back. I think I've still got to come back. I want to come back. There's a desire, a passion. My point to him was, first off, you sure you really want to do this? Like, the last 2 fight camps, it was tough. You didn't seem to have the same kind of drive as you used to have. You sure you want to do this? Is this like a middle-aged fantasy here you're going through here? And he said, no, I feel this. I want to come back. So my question to him was, if you're going to come back, are you just going to do the same thing? You're just going to come back to welterweight and do what you always did, which is come out and beat the best welterweights and just hold the title? You're just going to be doing the same thing. I thought, if you're going to come back, let's do something significant, something you haven't done before. And so the way I put it to him was, what are the 3 most persistent criticisms you always hear about Georges St-Pierre? Number 1, you never fought up a weight class. You never went up. Number 2, you fought so tactically sound, with such an emphasis on strategy and techniques or what have you, that matches could become dull. That the average fan was like, well, yeah, he's winning easily and it's dominant, but doesn't do it for me. It's not exciting. There's no drama in the fights. Okay. So you had this idea that on the one hand, he was very technically sound, strategically deep, but the fights weren't as exciting as they ought to be. The idea that he'd never gone up a weight category. And the 3rd most persistent criticism, he didn't finish fights. Okay, he was a very skilled fighter, but he wasn't finishing fights. So my point to him was, okay, if you're going to come back, let's do it in a way where you address those 3 things. Okay, George is always concerned about his legacy as a fighter. And if there were 3 persistent criticisms of Georges St-Pierre's legacy, it was those 3 things. You're not finishing fights, you never went up a weight class, and you're too tactical. Okay, you're not providing the drama that a fight should. So I said, let's change things. We got, in that 4 years, previous to that, whenever I was training George, I was training him for a fight. He was going to fight, he's fighting Nick Diaz, he's fighting Carlos Condit, he's fighting, whoever. And it was always getting him ready for a fight. You're fighting Matt Hughes in 2 months, let's get ready. Now you're retired. I'm not going to train you to fight some dude. I'm going to train you in jiu-jitsu. Freddie Roach is going to train you in boxing. In this sense, we had the time now to start working on finishing skills. A significant change occurred where my primary emphasis in training George in that 4-year layoff was in submissions. Now, happily, that happened at what time? The time the squad was coming out. So I had a group of some of the best submission peoples in the world for George to work with. So his submissions started getting better. Suddenly, Georges St-Pierre, if he got on your back, it was a problem. He's submitting people in the gym. I could run off some names. I won't do it because it's not the thing to do, but I could run off some names of people he submitted in the gym that would shock you, like well-known jiu-jitsu people. And for the first time, our primary emphasis wasn't on grapple boxing, it was submission. Freddie Roach was working on the mechanics of punching. George always had good in-out movement. He always had like that karate movement, the ability. He always had a strong jab. But now he's teaching him how to sit on a punch. Suddenly George had a left hook. Okay, and a guy who can integrate left hand between jab and left hook, that's a dangerous man. Okay. Everyone was worried, there's so much overreaction to George's jab that suddenly left hook opportunities were opening up, and now he was sitting on that left hook and people were getting hurt. So now for the first time you got a guy who's got submissions and he's hitting with genuine power. As he came back, there was a question of who's going to be the opponent. And the next thing I said is, well, you never went up a weight division. Go up to 85.
Now, was any consideration about going up to 85 because of the fact that Bisping was the champion?
No.
And George had trained with Bisping?
Because that decision was made before Bisping was the champion.
Really?
Yeah.
How far in advance was the decision made? Because Bisping had defended against Henderson.
Remember,
he'd won against
Rockhold. This was a 4-year project. Okay, I didn't.
So during these 4 years,
initially, I couldn't make that decision because another student of mine, Chris Weidman, was the 185-pound champion, and Chris and George would never fight each other. But once that was no longer an issue, then it was like, hey, this could work. This could be interesting.
So during the entire 4 years, he was talking about eventually coming back.
Not the entire 4 years. No.
Okay.
But he was training the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pushing him, okay, you're not fighting anymore. Let's do some submission grappling.
Right.
Okay. He stuck with Freddie Roach. He loves working with Freddie Roach. And so the training was going in different directions.
And who is this Muay Thai coach?
Mostly he works with Faraz Zahabi in TriStar, but that's more integrated.
Mm-hmm.
Faraz is a black belt of mine, so he often does jiu-jitsu with Faraz. I teach Faraz, and Faraz does a good job there. But Faraz ties things together. That's his principal function.
And I know he trained with Phil Nurse for a while as well.
Yeah. Then he trained with a lot of guys who came out of Thailand itself, from Tiger Muay Thai, Yod. That's a shortening of his actual name. They all have very long names, but Yod was one of his trainers. They trained him prior to Condit and Diaz. Did a fine job. So there's never been a shortage of coaches in his life, but there are certain things that seem to gel with him more than others. Interestingly, during that 4-year period, George had a strong rebirth into karate and worked with a lot of specialized karate people, including Raymond Daniels and others. They came mostly from the European point fighting karate circuit, and he was working with them a lot. And so they crossed a certain period of time where you're dealing with a different athlete now. This is a guy who's had 4 years off, and the training had gone in different directions. His finishing skills in both fisticuffs and grappling had gotten considerably better. He was toying with the idea of going up to 85 and experimenting with diet, etc., to get his body weight up. That's never an easy thing to do. And tactically, he was working more on the idea of being an exciting fighter through movement and pushing harder for the finish. And I thought those were 3 very, very healthy directions to go in. And this would, as it were, if he did come back, this would offer a genuine opportunity to address the 3 most persistent criticisms of his career. Initially, there was a lot of resistance from the UFC. I don't think they were fond of the idea at all. They wanted him to go to 170 and do what he had done. But George pushed hard for the fight at 85, and ultimately it happened in a rather strange way. Tyrone Woodley had a fight at 170, which wasn't the most crowd-pleasing fight, and Georges St-Pierre was supposed to fight Tyrone Woodley, and then the UFC said, you know what, fight Bisping, it's on. So we chose the Madison Square Garden. That's one of the great fight capitals of the world, and that's how it happened. So
there was consideration in fighting 170?
Yes.
And so this was the UFC's idea, but what about your plan for...
I thought, first of all, I'm not the matchmaker. I'm not the main policy maker. I don't want to say that I was the guy that suggested those ideas. And George seemed to like the idea. He said, if I'm going to come back, if I'm going to take the risk of a 4-year layoff and come back, it's a big risk. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, Muhammad Ali came back after 3 years and had 2 warm-up fights and still lost his title fight.
Yeah, but Muhammad Ali really wasn't working out. That was when the Vietnam War thing had happened.
Yeah, he was mostly doing tours of college campuses,
Yeah,
isn't he? Yeah,
he wasn't really working
George is
out.
working out the whole time and improving.
You
So,
could see the difference
yeah,
in Muhammad
yeah.
Ali's body when he came back.
But still, there's many other examples. Like Sugar Ray Leonard came back after layoffs. He had one successful and one very unsuccessful
Yes.
comeback, and he was working hard the whole time. So coming back is
It's a hard
it's a tricky,
process.
tricky thing.
Yeah.
And on many levels too, not just physical, but also psychological.
So now this colitis thing is throwing a monkey wrench into the gears.
Actually, it threw a monkey wrench during the camp.
Really?
Yeah, I could tell you some stories about that. That camp was, as good as the 4 years was, the camp itself, I can say it now because it's over, was a disaster. It was probably the
Really?
worst camp I've ever been involved in.
Really?
I was coaching, of course, the squad for ADCC. So ADCC, I believe, was around 6 weeks before George's fight. So I was in Finland and communicating with George, and he's like, feeling good. The moment I get back, I was going to go on a plane from Finland to Montreal and start the camp. George said to me, I've got stomach issues. And I was like, what do you mean, stomach issues? What does that even mean? Now, about 2 weeks into the camp, the issues got so bad that George literally could not. Now, this was a 6-week fight camp. It's a very short camp. Back in the day, we used to do 8 to 12 weeks, but George thought a shorter camp would be better. As he's getting older, he wanted a shorter camp. First 2 weeks were okay, but I was in the aftermath of the Finland expedition, and when I first went up, George said, "I got to cancel. Okay, I can't train." I'm like, "Fight's 4 weeks away," and George took 2 weeks off. There was a critical moment on a Friday evening where I said to Firas Zahabi, this is the second time I've had to say this to Firas Zahabi, the other was the Carlos Condit camp. I said, if George isn't training by Monday, we're going to pull the plug. There's no other way. I mean, we're talking about a 4-year layoff. And this camp is lost. It's dead in the water.
So 4 weeks out, he takes 2 weeks off.
I believe it might have been 5. I'll check the dates later. But
close, somewhere in
we're
that
talking
neighborhood.
very close. There was a critical 2-week period.
And
where
during that 2 weeks, what is he able to do?
Essentially nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah, just
no training.
Light drilling, some movement, and he was. And it occurred at the worst possible time. It wasn't at the start of the camp; it was in the middle of the camp. So the first 2 weeks were lost because then we had 2 weeks of inactivity. Then there's 2 weeks left, and I remember the first time I went up, I brought Jake Shields, Gary Toner, and Gordon Ryan with me. We came up and we went through some drills on the ground, and I was happy. You know, George looked okay on the ground. He did fine against the squad guys, and we worked on some specialized grappling stuff. And then the next day, he went to do a shoot box workout. Now, I could sit here all day and tell you adventures of Georges St-Pierre doing shoot box training with people. I've seen him spar everybody. Okay, I'm not going to mention names, but I've seen Georges St-Pierre take down effortlessly some of the biggest names in mixed martial arts in weight divisions far above his own. So many times per round, you just lose count. Like I'm afraid to even tell you the stories because people wouldn't believe me. I'm used to seeing Georges St-Pierre shoot boxing, bang, 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 down.
Right.
Okay. I've seen that since the start of his career. I watched Georges St-Pierre do a shoot box workout where he couldn't score a takedown. This is a fight's 2 weeks away. I'm just looking, going like, holy heck, what is this? He's getting hit. He's getting frustrated. He's getting tired. And I said to Firas, you know, this is a crisis. This is one of the biggest UFCs of the year. It's Madison Square Garden. He's the headline. The UFC had to pull some big things to get this fight to happen. They originally didn't want it. If we pull out now, it's going to look like a disaster. It's going to let George let the UFC down. And to his everlasting credit, George said, I'll be back on Monday and I'll be better. We went up and he dug in deep. What can I tell you? He's a trooper. He trained every day those last 2 weeks, and as each day went by, there was significant improvement. And I remember there was a distinct moment about 5 days before the end of the camp. I saw him do a shoot box workout, and he looked like the old George. And I was like, okay, I believe in this kid again. He can do it.
Jamie, will you please Google colitis? I don't know enough.
I believe you should
what that
Google
is.
ulcerative colitis.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something to do with stomach ulcers?
I'm not going to claim to be an expert, but yeah, I can tell you what the symptoms were. It was extreme stomach pain and inability to eat. It screwed up his entire diet.
And when did it start?
It started early in the camp and got progressively worse, and then
So before the camp, there was no issues? Here it goes.
None that he mentioned.
Ulcerative colitis is usually only in innermost lining of the large intestine, colon, and rectum. Forms range from mild to severe. Having ulcerative colitis puts a patient at increased risk of developing colon cancer. Symptoms including rectal bleeding, bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and pain. That sounds like a party.
Yeah. If you read can you bring it back? Read the first 4.
Treatment can help, but this condition cannot be cured. Requires a medical diagnosis, lab tests, or imaging, always required. Chronic, can last for years or be lifelong.
It's incredibly frustrating for him to deal with. And
it says treatments include medications and surgery.
Yeah.
Oof.
So it's a problem.
Surgery.
But it appeared to back off a little bit in the last 2 weeks. He came back. This is the kind of person Georges St-Pierre is. The morning of the fight, Saturday morning, we're in New York City in the hotel room. Faraz Sahabi, Freddie Roach, and myself are at the breakfast table. George comes down for breakfast. He's weighed in. He looks at his breakfast. Originally the plan, because it was a fight at 185, was to have George come in at a higher body weight. But he ended up weighing 191 pounds, which is exactly the same as he used to fight at welterweight, the same body weight. So that was kind of a disappointment, you know. And he quietly excused himself and went to the bathroom. Everyone else went away to do their things, and I sat there and I realized he's in the bathroom for an hour. He came out. I was like, George, you okay? And he looked at me and he said, I'm fine. But I knew he wasn't. And then he went out, fought, and then afterwards he told me, dude, I was in so much pain. And he was afraid to tell me because he would worry that if I cornered him and I thought he was compromised, I wouldn't corner him the way I normally would, that I would doubt him. So he kept it all inside, didn't say a word. And he's a good kid. You know, you can't help but admire a kid like that.
Wow. Well, that's what makes him a champion.
Yeah.
It's one of the things. It's less than perfect conditions. He could still rise to the occasion.
Yeah. Less than perfect. It was very far from perfect.
Now, you said that during the Johnny Hendricks fight, during the camp for that fight, when he decided to impromptu retire inside the octagon, that there was talk during the camp that he didn't want to fight.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Really, it centered around two things. One, I can not discuss because it involves the personal life of Georges St-Pierre. There were some things going on in his personal life that deeply affected him, and he was deeply unhappy with some circumstances in his personal life, and it's not appropriate for me to talk about those. And the second was the whole idea that had become an obsession with George at that time, which was the use of anabolic steroids in mixed martial arts. And he was deeply unhappy with what he perceived as the prevalence of the use of anabolic steroids in mixed martial arts as a whole and among his opponents in particular. And he wanted a testing program to be brought in for that fight. There was talk about it, but nothing came of it. And it became like this psychological obsession during the camp. And between those two issues, there was a lot of unhappiness. He came in, he did his training. You know, he's a professional athlete. It's not like he missed workouts or anything crazy like that. Wasn't going out at night or anything foolish. But there was a degree of unhappiness where I'm looking and thinking, how much longer can this go on?
Now, there was some talk about the Tyron Woodley fight, and then Tyron had this bad performance. But if George did get healthy and was confident enough in his health that he could get through an actual training camp, would he be interested in considering a fight with Tyron Woodley?
Absolutely. I think Tyron Woodley's a great champion. I know he gets a lot of stick, a lot of flack. That kid is talented.
Very
He's
talented.
very, very good. And
he doesn't think George wants to fight him. He was on the podcast the other day.
Yeah, I think people say that for reasons so that they can motivate someone to fight them, et cetera, et cetera.
There's that too.
There's a political aspect to it. I think that both athletes have a deep respect for each other.